Hey everybody, welcome to a long overdue course for using Blender for architecture design. This has been updated with version 4.3. We're going to be doing this building here, which is residential. And residential buildings, they tend to be a little bit trickier than office buildings, which is what I did in my last architectural master, which is this building over here, where it's really mostly about the shape of the actual building. In this video series, which I'm making available for you for free on YouTube, the idea is that we do learn some of the really cool and amazing procedural options, like for example, this facade here. We can change the facade layout based on different modules. As you can see, let me find a nice camera to show you even better. So if we go in here and I can go and change that. So it's got a lot of procedural things, including our wrap, which needs two of these wrapped and so on. So we still are covering some of these really cool things. However, the number one question that I have had while working with Blender is, can you do drawings with them? Can you do drawings with them? Can you do drawings with them? And I researched like all the current best ways to do it. And we're also going to be covering some of that. So that's a floor plan drawing out here. And it's still a work in progress. I have a couple of doors missing. There's no dimensions, but it is vector and this comes out directly from Blender. So this is what we're going to be working for in here. And if you want to support me, the files are going to be available on Patreon and uhstudioacademy.com, but the actual course, I am making it free and available to everybody on YouTube. Why? Because I really want as many people, as many architects and designers to be able to use Blender for architecture design as possible. And let's just walk through some of the views. So the final building that we're going to create is going to be something like this, but not exactly, right? So because I tend to change things a little bit when I redo things, just to keep it more interesting, or maybe I think of a different idea. And again, this is a floor plan. I have loads of sketches and things. So cool. We're ready to get started. So let's get started here. First, I'm going to show you some of the settings that I use in preferences. So edit preferences that might be a little bit different than the default ones. First off, I like to make my interface a little bit bigger by increasing the resolution scale, but that's mostly so you guys can see a little bit better with what I'm doing on the screen here, in case you're using a tiny screen, which a lot of us tend to be these days. Then we go to key map, and what I change is the middle mouse action. By default, it's orbiting. So we move around by pressing the middle mouse, or rather orbit. I prefer to pan because we tend to do that much more. To orbit, it's shift middle mouse. Click to do this. Obviously, you need a key. It's best to have a mouse for this class. You can do it with a trackpad, but it's much more preferable to have a mouse. The other thing I change is spacebar action. By default is play, and I tend to press that accidentally a lot. And because we're not going to be dealing with so much with animation, I prefer to have a search. And this is a really hidden and powerful feature in Blender. You can actually search by pressing that spacebar for anything you can imagine. If you don't have the spacebar, F3 is actually the same hotkey to do that. So let's say I want to duplicate the object, but I have no idea where to duplicate it. I don't even know where to find it in any of the menus. We can just search for it. And alas, we can duplicate things. In Blender, if you don't know, you can press X, Y, and Z while you're in a transform to lock an axis. And then we can type a specific number, like let's say 5 units. I'm using meters at this point, but it doesn't matter. You can use feet and inches or millimeters, and it can have the same effect. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to go through some add-ons, some extensions. Now that we can have online extensions. These are the ones that I actually have enabled by default, but I'm going to go as them while we end up needing them. So just a really quick overview of the Blender's user interface in case you're not that familiar with it. Here we have the sidebar, which is a very important part because it gives us the dimensions. It gives us the scale, rotation, and location. Don't know why I went through this backwards, but these are important. And I really like the question but Blender is not precise enough for architecture. Trust me, it can be as precise as any other software out there, even more so because we have the location and the rotation and the scale and the dimensions exposed at all times while we're here. in Rhino, it's not even this easy to have this information up. And we can go to object mode and edit mode. Edit mode is where we edit things. So we can click on vertex, edge, or face. And the hotkeys for this are 1, 2, 3 on the numbers above the QWERTY or AZERTY or whatever keyboard you're using, instead of the number pad, because the number pad numbers are more for views. So I'm pressing the number pad and this is 1, 2, 3, but I know a lot of people don't have number pads these days on the laptop, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. Cool. So edit mode, vertices. So we can move things around if we press the move. And again, with this gizmo, while we're active, I can press a number and press 4, and we got something happening here. Let's hold now this edge by pressing 2 and move this 2. And now we got something else happening here. Let's erase this. I'm going to swap between object and edit mode with the tab key. That's the most important hotkey that you need to learn. And let's get rid of it. And now we've got this little fella here, which is rather interesting. Anyways, so let's go ahead and we're going to add a modifier. So here we've got the properties, the outliner, and the timeline, which we are going to change. And in the properties, the area we're going to deal with the most is modifiers, which is this blue wrench tool over here. We want to add a modifier. And now you can search around. The ones we're going to be dealing with the most is generate, and some deform, and naturally a lot of geometry nodes. Well, not a lot, and they're fairly simple, so I don't want you to get scared. We're actually going to do like quite a few things which are, let's say, ease up our workflow here. So let's go ahead and add a modifier, search, and we want to type array. And now we add duplicates. We can duplicate a modifier by clicking here and this little arrow and click on duplicate. And now let's change from factor x to 0 to factor y to 1, or maybe 1.2. This is all relative offset. And now we have an army of these spiky little objects that we've got going on over here. And the cool thing is that they're all linked. So if I hit tab to go into edit mode, hit 1, click on this vertex, make sure we're in move, and move this down, you see everything transforms. Now let's click on 3 to move a face. Let's move this face over here. And if we move it, the really cool thing is because this is using relative offset, which is basically the bounding box that it's in individually. No, it's invisible, invisible. It's not visible. I forget the word now. So if we move that, you can see that everything stretches out. And if we move it this way, also everything kind of stretches nicely. And if we want to have this less spiky object now for specific dimensions, with specific dimensions, again, that's more or less the bounding box that we're dealing with. We can specify it here. Let's say we want it to be 5 meters by 5 meters by 2.5 meters tall. So now we've got something that's exactly that size. Now, important thing to consider is this scale here that we have, which is object scale. We should keep this to 1, or in other words, reset as often as possible, because all the modifier properties, all the object-based modifications that we do, which are not at the mesh level. The mesh level is inside, right? When we're in edit mode, this is mesh level, and you can see we don't have that kind of information here. But the object, the container, that contains all these kind of scale, rotation, location properties. So we want to make sure that the scale is at 1. So we go to object, apply, scale, and now it's 1 to 1 to 1. So things like array, constant, distance, that matters. So let's undo this just to show you really quickly. Now we don't have the scale applied. So if I go in here and I add a constant offset, our 1 meter is not exactly 1 meter. It's 1 meter times 0.25. So it's 0.25 meters. Whereas now if we go and object, apply scale, now it's exactly 1 meter, and you see it gets a little bit bigger. So very important to keep this in mind. In this year's Blender conference, Andrew Price, Blender guru, donut guy, was talking about improving some of Blender's UI, and this was definitely one thing that he mentioned, which is just having a visual cue when the object scale is not 1 to 1 to 1, because it does tend to get used quite a lot. Cool. All right. So in here you can also see we have a camera and we have a light. Your colors might be a little bit different. Both of them are typically black. I like to edit those just a little bit by going into Edit, Preferences, Themes, 3D Viewport, and in here we've got a color for the camera and a color for the empty. And I like to have them, oh yeah, the empty, that's another kind of placeholder object that I like to modify the color, and the light, which is here. So that's more or less your default scene over here. In the outliner, we have an eye icon, which hides things temporarily, and we have a camera icon, which hides them at render time. So even though something is visible, let's go to our camera view just to see what is visible, and we have our cube.001 selected. Right now, we see it in the viewport, but if I go and render, we go here, render image, you see there's nothing there. Why is there nothing there? Because we didn't render it, or it's not turned on. Now, if I press F12 as the hotkey, now we get to see it. So very important thing to keep in mind that Blender has this extra granularity, which is visible in the viewport and visible at render time. It has a lot more, but I'll cover that a little bit later. Cool, so that's really the beginning, and that should get you more or less comfortable with the UI, with the different kinds of things that we're dealing. And of course, I didn't mention a lot of things, but hopefully enough for you to start to get playing in case you're brand new to Blender. Now, with that out of the way, let's get rid of this cube. Let's exit out of the camera, and we're going to add a new object. We do this by clicking here, Add Mesh, and here you can see all the different kinds of objects that we can add. 95% of the time, we're going to be adding a plane. 4.5% of the time, we're going to be adding a cube, and the rest 0.5% could be text or a lattice sometimes, an image, lights, cameras, and so on. So we're going to be working a lot with planes. And here it is, a plane. The default size is 2 by 2 meters. And now we're going to make a nice ground plane for our, let's say, massing. So we're going to start with the massing, right? So we want to make this quite large. So something like 40 meters. By the way, if you click and hold, whoops, I didn't do it this time. It has to be quick, not holding, because yeah, that slides it. Click it. You have to play a little bit. You can modify multiple properties at the same time. I can even click all 3 of them. Right now, I just want this to be 40 by 40 meters. The scale is big, but it's okay. It's just a ground plane. We're not dealing with anything significant just yet. Now, I also like to have a person at all times in my scene, just to have a better sense of the scale. And this is a typically average person, 1.8 meters tall. He's got a rotation, I guess. At some point, he was rotated. And this is a free person that comes from Sketchfab. I don't think that Sketchfab is available anymore. I think it's just Fab now, because Epic Engine, Unreal, they're sort of combining all the things that they bought up into one store, which is now called fab.com. I don't even know if they have them there as open source. Anyways, this will be included with the files that will be available on Patreon or uhstudioacademy.com. So cool, now we got a person. Let's add another plane. Shift A is the hotkey to adding things. Add mesh plane. And by the way, why don't I start with a cube? I get that question sometimes. I don't like starting with a cube because this origin point is quite important. And with the cube, it's exactly in the middle. Whereas with the plane, if we go in a plane, I go into edit mode and we go here, we have an extrude tool, an extrude. If we go back into object mode now, you see that orange point, which is the origin point for each object. Each object has one of those, right? So if we click around, we can see it. That stays at 0. And that's really important because, you know, with architecture, we want to make things at the ground plane as much as possible, whether it's at the ground floor or if it's at the upper floor, so positioning furniture and so on. So that's why I tend to start always with the plane. Cool, so now that we have this kind of cube with an origin at 0, 0, not 0, 0, but Z0, we can go ahead and start to dimension this to like 20 meters by 20 meters. By maybe, how tall should that be? Let's say 16 meters. That's a little large. So let's go with like 8 meters. No, wrong side. So maybe this is like 16 meters. and that's 4 meters. Whoops. Or we can just drag things until we think it looks good. So again, 20 meters, and maybe this is not 16, but that's like 12 meters. So the building that we're going to be making is not going to be terribly big. So here you go. First massing, you might notice that we have some kind of snaps happening in here. So Blender has a snap system, which is over here, in case you're not familiar with it. And we have all kinds of different snaps. We have increment, grid, vertex, edge, phase, volume, and so on. And this magnet icon, when it's blue, it's enabled. When it isn't, it is disabled. Now, a really cool thing is that we can temporarily enable it. For example, because I have snaps already enabled, but this is not turned on, if I click and drag this to move it around, and if I hold Control key on my keyboard, I can still temporarily snap. And I find that quite useful. Okay, so let's grab our person. I'm going to select him from the outline because I know he's hidden somewhere over here, and put the person over here. So we just start to have a sense of scale. I like to name things so they make sense. So here, this plane is going to be ground, and this is going to be massing. Okay. That light, I'm going to get rid of it for now. So we have a ground and we have a massing. So that's our very, very first steps. Let's duplicate all those things, maybe except the person. I don't want to, or we can also click and drag to select things in the outliner. And we can either go to Object, Duplicate Objects, and here you can also see the hotkey, which is Shift D. Very important one to keep in mind as well. Or if you forget everything, you can always press the spacebar or F3 and look for Duplicate Objects. Press X on the keyboard to lock, and we can move it. Let's see, what is that? A nice number, like 50. We can also just enable increments, and we can move things really nicely along the grid. I have to make sure they're enabled first. And now you see how they're snapping. Right now they're snapping at 10 centimeters. If we zoom out a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Oh, okay, I thought it should at some point start snapping at, there you go. Now it's snapping at that larger increment. It's whatever the grid that we see, right? So here we see this kind of grid. And if we zoom in, and I'm going to press G, G basically does the same as the move, but without a gizmo, which is grab for move. And you can see that we're moving around. Okay, let's move it around a little bit more. There you go. So that's our massing again. Now, what if we try to adjust it a little bit, maybe to match the shape that you saw me present here, which is something like this. Right, and I do have a front view where we have one section that's a little bit higher, and then it steps back and it steps back, and perhaps as the context is going to show, there is a shorter context on one side and a taller context on the other, and there's more breathing ground, and it could be all kinds of reasons. You know, it could be lighting regulations, or it could be two plots and this plot has been combined, which has a shorter minimal area, or it could be just a design decision as well, although rarely design decision, right? In this case, you know, if we could max it out these days, because we do work in a capitalist society, we're going to probably have that space filled up too, but still with the design language that could somehow be this kind of snaking element around. I tend to like these a lot, to come and then just have something maybe that matches this, that sits outside of it. Anyways, so that's more or less what we're going to replicate over here. And this is also based on modules. We have the facade modules here, which are about 3 meters tall by 4 meters wide. So the module is a bit more generous than your typical module. But before we even get to that, let's just have a little bit of fun of sculpting in object mode, or rather edit mode. So let's go here, click on edit mode, and I'm going to start introducing you to some tools that we have over here. And we can make this toolbar, which has not all the tools, but some of the most common tools over here, a little bit larger by dragging it. First, we drag it a little and it becomes 2 columns, but if we drag it a little bit more, we can actually see the names. And I find that quite useful for beginners. In case you're not sure which command is which, you can also see the name of it there. So we're going to use loop cuts a lot, and loop cuts only work with faces that have 4 vertices. In this case, all of our faces have 4 vertices, so that's quite easy. But triangulated mesh or faces that have more than 4 vertices cannot be easily loop cut. So over here, whatever tool that we have, in the 3D viewport header, second line, we can see the tool options. Those two options actually live in 3 different places. One of them is here, the other one is in the sidebar, which is over here. This is actually the exact same information. You can see here we have number of loop cuts, and we also have it there. Why is it in 3 different places? It gives flexibility for different people that like to work in different ways. By default, this is probably the easiest place to pay attention to, but I'm just making you aware because it does exist in quite a few different places. Okay, so here in loop cuts, we want to create 2 loop cuts, and we just click. You can see it highlighted, click, and it automatically creates them. Next, let's click on select box or maybe extrude region. Make sure we're in face selection. Click on these 2 faces, extrude, shift click to deselect this face and extrude again. And now we've made something that's way too tall. So we can go and enable X-ray mode so we can select even the back faces. Vertices will probably work a little bit better. We can go to select box, select all of these, then go to move and move them down a little. And now we have something that's a little bit similar. We can continue to refine it by clicking on the face selection, clicking on this face, shift click, and then moving them. Now notice I'm snapping with the grid. I do tend to like working with the grid initially because it does make things with better dimensions without having to put too much thought into it. It's whatever looks good. Well, that's not always the case, right? We have specific plots with specific sizes, so we do have to keep that in mind a lot of times too, but here we can actually see the overall dimensions. So in the X, which is the red, it's 26 meters by 12 meters by 17 meters high. So that's an easy way to do it. So let's duplicate all this, except the person. I'm just going to click on ground and control click on the outliner and then shift D and then press the middle mouse button. It works the same as pressing on the keyboard X, Y, or Z to lock. Somewhere over here. Okay, so now we're going to start making that kind of element, which is, let's put these guys over here, which is the outside, right? So it's this thing over here, which is actually very, very parametric. It's pretty cool. So how do we do that? First, let's go into edit mode. We want to select a couple of things here, only these edges. So let's go on edge selection, click on this edge, shift click to select all these edges. And well, we can do it either with edge selection or even face selection. So let's actually do it with face selection because I want to show you how we can select face loops. So if we alt click and somewhere in the middle, you see we select all those faces. That works also with edges. So if I alt click in edge selection, we select the whole edge loop to wherever it can get it, because there's continuity from here and then there's discontinuity because the faces are facing kind of different directions. So what we want to do is delete these bottom faces over here. So we can press either the delete button or X because it keeps everything close to the left hand. And this is my left hand. I'm just mirrored myself here. And X, and then here we have a bunch of different options. So now we select faces. Okay, so now if we click, or rather alt click to select this face loop, and now let's select inverse. Select invert, and let's delete all these faces. So X and then faces. Okay. Now here we have a little bit more information that we really need, so we can get rid of these edges. So let's select these 2 edges and then X, and we want to go to the bottom option, which is edge loops. So now we have something that's quite straightforward and quite simple. So we're going to work with modifiers now. So let's go and add a modifier. The first one we're going to add is bevel. And bevel makes the edges nice and round. Well, depending on the number of segments that you have. If you have just a single segment, it's not so round. Also, notice our scale here is not 1 to 1 to 1. So this amount 0.1 is multiplied by different factors in different directions. So let's go to Object, Apply Scale, And now you see it's quite different and more uniform, let's say. Let's change this to 0.5. Now let's change the segments to 10. And you can see right away, this is already like looking super nice and super smooth. Next, let's add a solidify modifier, which gives us a thickness. And the thickness wants to be something like 0.4 meters. And let's go in the other direction. It's really up to us which direction we want to go in. I do it in this way because the internal modules, I want them to have sort of a clearance that the size of them is actually like full, so the modules stay uniform. But maybe, you know what? I do think it looks better when we have it this way because this external radius is consistent. So that looks a little bit better. Now we have a part that's actually zooming around. So we need to grab this edge and we're going to extrude it. So here we can click on extrude region, and instead of normal, because there is really not a normal, sometimes there is on edges, but we want to use X, Y, Z. And here we have a gizmo that gives us the different options. And then here as well. And now we've got something that looks a little bit more like our initial concept that we've got over here. Excellent. So that's it. That's very straightforward and very simple. Next, let's start working with the facade modules. Now, before we go too deep, I want to mention that I'm doing this to show you the best way to use some of these tools. I am very clear on the typical design process where we start with a site, we sketch out in plan. In fact, I can show you a bunch of plans that I sketched on this before, but because this is more of a modeling exercise than an actual building, that's why we're doing it in a way to show you the tools as quickly as possible without thinking terribly too much about the actual site, because that really depends on you. That's where you step in. You take the tools, the possibilities, the workflows that we teach in this class, and then you take those to whatever site is required and do your magic there. Okay, so let's duplicate this again, Shift D. Let's put it somewhere over here. And now let's start creating some kind of facade. So this cursor, wherever we place it, a new object appears there. It's also used for snapping, but also for placement for initial objects. So let's go to Add Mesh Plane. Go in here, go into Edit mode. Let's create a loop cut. Make sure it's just one loop cut. Somewhere over here. Okay, and now select Invert and X to delete. And we want to delete all these edges. Let's select this, the only edge that we have. Go to extrude region, X, Y, Z, and we extrude that, it doesn't matter what, because now, because we have the origin point in a really nice place, we can go into object mode and play with our size over here. So dimensions in the X, let's make that 3 meters. Rather, yeah, that's 4 meters. And in the Z, that's going to be 3 meters. And, you know, that covers like floor to floor height. So we have, you know, 500 millimeters in there to cover all of that. So that's our module, which is, everything is going to be based on it. We have the facade, we have the structure, we call all the structural walls, and we have the internal layout, which is based on, you know, where these facade modules occur. Again, it's a little bit more generous for bedrooms and a little bit maybe less generous for the common living areas. But once you understand how this works, you can go ahead and modify it to whatever dimensions you start to figure out work with you. So what do you think we're going to do next? Let's go and add an array modifier. And right now, here in the viewport header, I'm going to enable wireframe. So you see the wires a little bit better and a little bit easier. Let's also save the file. Always a good idea to do it every once in a while. Double check I'm recording. All things good. Now let's go back to select box and change this count to 3. And now let's duplicate. Factor X is 0. Factor Z is 1. And we're going to have, I forget what we had originally, but we can play with this just to see what works best for us. Great. So we have one part of this facade module. Now let's duplicate this, or we're going to do a linked duplicate because we want all the faces to be sort of linked. What's a linked duplicate? So let's do first both a simple duplicate and now object duplicate linked. I'm going to put this somewhere over here. So now let's go into the original one, select our face, and let's try to do something. Maybe we're going to inset the face. And we're going to extrude. And none of these are actually working. So let's undo that. I thought I did a linked duplicate, but it seems like I did not. So let's try this again. Object, duplicate, linked. Okay, now let's go into edit mode. And there. So a linked duplicate it's a different object, but it shares the same mesh data that we have inside of the original object. So now, as you can see, anything that we do here is also being done on this object over there, whereas this one is not. And how can we tell if these are like sharing object data? So we go to this green icon here, which is the object data properties, and here we have a data block, which is called plane.008. The names don't matter much, but here we have a number that says 2. So that means 2 objects are using that same data block. We can rename this, so we have it as something as facade panel. Now this is, again, the data inside of the object. The object's name is still plane. We can also rename that to facade panel. But that's a different name, right? You can see here we have facade panel, and inside of it we have this triangle icon is mesh. And that's shared by 2 users. Whereas here, that plane.009 has no 2 users. We can also make this unique, or any object data, any data block inside of Blender, because materials tend to work the same way, geometry nodes, a lot of things tend to work the same way. So if you click on here, that's facade panel.001. So this information is no longer shared. So if we try to change this, you see that that's staying relevant. The cool thing is though, we can always go back by selecting here and finding the original facade panel. And now that's being adjusted, that's being modified. So that's basically like blocks in AutoCAD, but also a lot more powerful. So we can share a lot of data. Let's do a lot of these things now. Okay, let's delete these 2 and let's go to object, duplicate linked, Alt D is the hotkey for that. Make sure we lock in the x-axis, and now it's a different object and the modifiers are at object level. So we can change the modifiers that are on top of the object, but the mesh data, the data block inside of the object stays the same. It's really cool. It takes a while to wrap your head around, but it can actually give you a lot more flexibility. Let's make this a little different, I think, than last time. I'm going to make it maybe not higher, but 1 over. And let's move this one over. 4. This is the nice thing with working with a grid. I don't even need to look at things now, and I know they're like snapping really nicely. And maybe this one has 2 in this direction. And let's double check. The data is shared. Let's just call this facade element. And again, it's always nice because you can see the outliner can get quite busy quite quickly. So it's a good idea to start naming things. The sooner the better. Or we can also organize things in collections, and that's essentially like layers in other programs. We can do it a couple of ways. So we can click here and create a new collection, and then select the objects and drag them in here. Or there's a hotkey for that. Blender has a hotkey for absolutely everything. It takes a while to learn them, but once you do start to use the program a bit more, then it's really easy to use as many hotkeys as possible. So now I have these 2 planes selected, and I can go and press M and move to new collection, and we say collection 2. Now, with just 2 objects here, it's fairly easy to do it in the outliner, but sometimes, you know, the names are all over the place, so you have to click here and then click like really far down. It's much easier to do it in the viewport. So this same hotkey is one that I find fairly useful a lot. Let's rename this, double click, say facade. This is going to be facade as well. Or facade base mesh. Let's start with this one because it's gonna, you see here what happens in Blender. So if we have something and we duplicate it, it just adds .001, .002, and so on. Facade base Let's copy that, and this is going to be facade base. I'll just leave it like that, and you'll see it adds.001. In Blender, you're not allowed to have the same name of objects. Okay, now let's duplicate this again, Alt-D. So now it should be in the right collection. And let's say facade base, but you are allowed to have different kinds of objects with the same name. So here we are. Go back into the outliners modifier, and we're going to change here the count in the Z direction to 2, and the count in the X direction to 1. Okay, cool. So now we have this kind of setup, and that's going to be the base meshes. So we're going to be filling these faces. We're going to do it like at first as a single one, so you understand how we do it, and then I'll show you how we do different kinds of faces. So first we want to move this now a little higher. So maybe the ground floor is 4 meters high instead of just 3 meters. For retail, maybe for office space and so on. Excellent. And now let's move this somewhere over here so it aligns nicely. Now those locations are not great. So let's change that Y to minus exactly 5. And because we're dealing with a lot of objects, now if I click enter, what does it do? It should have just moved 1, and you can see here there's a slight difference. And if you want to move all of them, let's click on minus 5 and then Alt and enter, and now that's going to move all of them. And this here 4.0006, sometimes Blender doesn't compute the right number because it doesn't work with floats, with double numbers. It just works with float numbers. Can't really tell you exactly what the difference is. I just know that AutoCAD and Rhino work with, now I forget them, is it float or double? Well, you guys probably can tell me better, but the precision in Blender sometimes is not as good, especially when we're dealing with decimal spaces. If we are working with centimeters or with millimeters, then we're not using decimal spaces and the precision is better. But in this sense, you know, this is, what is this? This is like 0.6 millimeters, right? So it's actually not going to affect our process, but I'm just mentioning it out there because sometimes numbers do go crazy, but they're at least to the 4th or to the 5th decimal. So it shouldn't be anything to be too worried about. Great. So now that we have this already set up, also we should make this a little bit nicer. And another hotkey, it's going to be a lot. So Shift S. It has this pie menu for selection and for cursor and things like that. We are going to be using selection to cursor and cursor to select it the most. But right now, I want to apply the selection to the grid. So wherever it is, it's going to move it just enough that this point over here aligns much nicer to the grid, and they all do, right? Because we're working with that like central point. Great. Now, we can start to adjust our base mesh so it aligns better with these kinds of facade modules. So let's go into edit mode. We're going to be using, instead of grid, let's use vertex. And we might want to turn off solidify here. We can turn it off only in the edit mode, so it's easier to edit. Let's go to move. And with this enabled, we just click and snap. Super easy and fun. That's what I like as well. So that's yeah, one of the reasons why I really love to teach Blender, especially for architecture design, is because it does tend to be a lot more fun. And if we're spending hours, days, weeks, months designing, we might as well have fun doing it. And use a system that works better with us and can express what we are doing a bit better. And here we're going to have the entrance. Ideally, now this building is a lot longer than the one I had before, where I had the entrance snuck in here. Now the entrance is going to have to be somewhere else, just because this thing, the corridor, is going to be quite long. And when we have such a long corridor, the traveling distances from either side might be too much. So let's stop this somewhere over here. So we're going to have the entrance over there, and this is going to be similar to what we have underneath, but slightly different. Now, if you click on edit mode, and you can see that this thing kind of goes away. And this is what I was talking about before. Now, because we're insetting this, everything is going in the opposite direction, right? It's going in the negative direction. If we change the solidify to +1, now we know that more or less our modules are exactly the same, except some of them have those corners filleted. And we do have this gap, but that's all right. Okay, now this is getting quite wide. I think for building this wide, we can go and adjust the massing a little bit more. Maybe here we have 5 modules, and yeah, we just increase everything with 1. Let's go back and edit the solid part of the facade, and we just need to click these 3 faces and move them all together. There you go. That's looking pretty good. So that's more or less it. We have a massing that's kind of done, which is incredible, because that's taking less than 45 minutes. Great. Let's add a couple of finishing touches for this first part. So again, this cursor, I'm positioning it. We can also shift right click to place it in a different place, somewhere over here. And well, actually we can do this a couple of ways. We can create a new plane and kind of do the same thing that we were doing with the facade, or we can go in here and Blender. I find it many times it's a lot easier to grab an element like an edge, face, vertex, or multiple selection and items from an existing object than create one from blank, because the workflow would be exactly the same where we had here. We start with a plane, we add a loop cut, we delete all the edges, we extrude and so on. It can get a bit tedious. So now we have this edge, which is quite nice. It's doing exactly what we need. Shift D to duplicate it, and let's snap it somewhere over here and here. And now we need to separate this, because this needs to be its own object. We're not going to be concerned with the same kinds of modifiers that we have happening with the solid part of the facade. So to do that, we go to Mesh, Separate, Selection. And now that has become its own object. So to select it, we have to go into Object Mode, click on it, and now go into Edit Mode. And while we're at it, let's delete this solidifier because we're not going to need it. Great. And we can also make this parametric as well, in the sense that maybe we have not a completely glass facade, but we have a solid element, so kind of like a base, and then glazing in between them. So we know our modules are 4 meters, so we can work with that same dimension. So let's extrude this 2 meters. And now let's extrude it again 2 meters. So one part is going to be solid and the other one is going to be glass. And then we're going to array that. So let's go ahead and click here. Now the glass is going to be completely separate. So to do that, you see now if I try to move this, it's connected. We can right click and separate, not separate, because separate actually makes it a separate object. We want split. So split disconnects the connected vertices. It could be well, yeah, they usually share vertices between different meshes. So now if I try to move that, you can see that this is separate. Let's go and start creating some materials so we can visualize this a little better. So here's the material tab. And for any object, we have material slots. So let's add a material slot. We don't need to do that, by the way. Let's Control Z. And what do we have here? We have solidify. So back to materials, and let's create a new material and call it ground solid. Okay. And let's create a new material slot now and create a new material again, or we can choose one of the existing ones. I have some over here. That's fine. Or we click on new and let's call this glass. Okay. Now we have this face selected. By default, everything gets the first layer. And to change it, we have a lot of tabs here. The important ones is viewport display and surface. This preview, if you open it accidentally, it renders something. So you can slow down Blender a lot. So I never use that. So I keep it somewhere near the bottom. Viewport display is important because that displays in the viewport. So it has its own separate settings than the actual rendered settings. and it gives us an easy way to identify different elements. So our glass, we're going to make it slightly blue, and you can see this is not blue yet. Why is it not blue? Because we haven't assigned it. So with the face selected, we click on assign, and now this has become blue. Everything else has the first layer, and if we change the color, you can see that that changes as well. Now, because they're separate but part of the same object, a nice thing that we can do is extrude just this region. And we have a bevel, that's why it's looking like a pill. Let's see, we're going to extrude minus 0.4. And now let's go to modifiers and remove this bevel because we don't need it anymore. Great, so that's it. Why do we separate the object? Because if we didn't have it separated and we were still sharing those vertices, we wouldn't get this rear solid face over here. In fact, let's move that rear face a bit as well. So let's go to move and move it 0.1, so 10 mil inside. Great, so that's just something that looks quite solid. Now let's add an array modifier. And start arraying. Excellent. And the last one is going to be a little bit different, right? Because we probably want to leave some space behind, like that radius, this cut over here with glass. Yeah, you can do it, but there's probably no reason to do it. So we can cut this glass somewhere over here. And there we're going to have a solid element. So there are a couple of ways to do that. One is, and we also have some intersections that are happening here, but again, we are dealing with something that's in concept phase, right? So the idea for me is always to try to express creatively a project option as quickly as possible, not as accurately as possible. Even though you can see here, we're actually getting really accurate. You know, we know the radius of these, we know the exact sizes, everything is snapping to a grid. So that's very accurate. But things like these kinds of intersections here, you know, ideally these should go up to here, but here they should go down to there. That's probably best left to a different phase. The only thing I'm going to do now is with this rounded element that we have here with the solid facade, I'm going to slightly move this inside of this glass. Let's disable the snaps. I'm just going to go to grid by default and move that in the negative direction because the arrow is pointing in that direction, minus 0.1 there. So that's going to have a bit less of an impact of that sort of intersection. We are going to have another solid element because I like to separate our base from the middle of the building as much as possible. And so we can go back to our original here, click on X-ray, click on vertex selection, select these vertices over here, and global local, in this case it doesn't matter because they're in the same. By the way, if you lose this window, it's this little arrow over here, right? For the sidebar, or hotkey N. And let's move this down ever so slightly, so 3.8 meters. Okay, so now we have a gap, but what we care about is that there's no intersection over here. We don't see those edges aligning at the exact same place. So let's decrease the width by 1. And now let's duplicate this object. So Shift D, move it somewhere over here, and let's enable the snaps with grid again and snap. Okay, so this is an excellent reason to show you one of Blender's new features, which is snapping with a base point. Believe it, it took a while for that feature to get implemented. So how does that work? So G to move, press B. That's the thing that it's a little bit still tricky because it allows, it depends on a lot of hotkeys, right? So G, then B to select the base point. And we can also move around in the 3D viewport by holding Alt or Shift Alt to rotate. And it's not even snapping at the right thing. I'm not sure why. Oh, that's why. Let's make sure we're at vertex. Let's try it again. So G, B, now we're snapping at the right one. And we snap it over here. So now that's perfectly snapped, even though, you know, we have everything more or less aligned quite nicely. So we are aware of where the snaps are. Why is this going in the right direction? Okay, so our origin point is in a bit of a strange location. So we can move that origin point so we have nicer numbers in this bottom corner over here. We can do that by clicking on options and affect only origins. Now with the snaps already enabled, we can go and press G to move And that's nicely moving over there. Let's do the same over here. G, move. Maybe even on the inside. So it has the nice line. We don't have an inside here. So we can actually drag, and that snaps, and that's nicely aligned now. Okay. Now, another thing that's really important is, okay, how do we know if we have this origin and you're trying to move things like G and you know nothing's moving? So you can tell because we have this X, Y, Z that are indicated here, which is, for me, is a little bit too subtle. But if I'm moving the origin point in this way, there is no kind of, other way except this X, Y, Z. And because this is kind of hidden inside of this menu, I wish this option was just sitting out here. Just make sure you disable it right away. That's what I do. Like, I move something and then I go back and I edit it. Now we don't need this array here anymore. Great. And now let's make this window smaller by 1 meter. So I'm going to type 1 and minus after. The really nice thing about Blender is that the negative can be toggled at any point. It doesn't need to come in the beginning of a number when we're typing a number, and we can keep toggling it by pressing minus. Great. Now let's duplicate this edge. Shift D to duplicate and press Y, and we're going to snap to this edge over here. Let's extrude 0.5. I think that's the distance that we were using. Now let's select this face. So I am clicking Alt-A a lot, and sometimes I forget that I'm even clicking all these hotkeys. So selection, O is A. None is Alt-A. So to deselect everything is Alt-A. And now let's go to the extrude region tool. And let's drag this out. We're only going to drag it to the middle. And we can snap to the middle. So edge center. If we click on that. Now I don't want to extrude this time though, because we're going to create duplicate geometry. And now it's snapping exactly to the middle. Excellent. So what do we have? We have a kind of more, let's say, solid base and something that starts to float out of it, right? First, we have this kind of element that's happening over here, and then we have the facade. And the facade is going to do its own sort of story. But that's the intent that we have here. I kind of am moving away generally from having like without having a lot of glazing, a lot of glass on the facades, because first off, you're either having blinds or shades, like I am here actually right now. I have external roller blinds because it's lovely sun, but it's way too strong right now, and I even have to have like an extra light for what I need. And second off, in a lot of places, it is a lot dustier than, let's say, Northern Europe and the United States, which means that that glazing, that glass needs to be cleaned quite a lot. All right, so we're in a pretty good position now. And what we're going to do is mirror like a lot of these things to fill the backside. And once we do that, we actually have a base massing done. So how do we do that? We can do a couple of things. Because we have two objects here, we can just link them as duplicates and then rotate them. Or if we move now the origin point to over here, to both objects, they're going to automatically mirror. So let's take a look. Now we know how to move origin points. So we just go in here and snap. So G to move it. And let's make sure. By the way, we can shift click to have multiple of these. Let's try this again. G. And I never tried to move two vertices at once. I don't know if they're going to snap at the same place or not. Oh, they do. Nice. Oh no, they don't. That one is over there. So they're keeping their relative location. That's fine. So now they're all exactly at this point, and along that axis is where we're going to mirror. So let's go now and add a modifier. Search, mirror, and change it from X to Y, and disable the X. And now that's mirroring, and you see it's using exactly this origin point. Let's make sure we turn affect only origins to mirror. Let's do the same with this bottom, although probably, now that I'm thinking of it, because let's say this is the front of the building, that's the back of the building, we're not going to have a solid facade. a glass facade, because this is not street front. Let's say that this is our street. In fact, let's make it a bit more street-like. Let's extrude this now 3 meters, the negative direction. Extrude. By the way, E is the key to extrude, which does the exact same thing as the extrude region here. So minus 0.1. And now doesn't matter what we have here, but just an indication that we have a street, and this is the street edge and this is the plot. In fact, we can go and start naming this. So let's create some new materials on this ground plane. The first one is called road. Don't like all caps. Road. Then we have curb. Then we've got pavement. And then we have, let's just call it green for now, with an N, not an M. And let's give them slightly different colors so we understand which is which a bit better. Again, these are just indicative in the viewport display. We're not going to play with the real colors, with the real materials a little bit later. Curb is fine. Pavement, maybe that's just a little darker. And the green is just ever so slightly green. Now we need to go and apply that. We need another loop cut for the pavement. So let's go and click on loop cut. Hold it here, and this time we're going to click and hold and move it over here. So that moved it all the way to the edge. It looks like there's none because the vertices are overlapping right now, but it's still there and it's selected. Lucky for us, because otherwise that selection would be a bit difficult. And now let's move this 0.1. There you go. And now let's select these two faces. Apply curb. Select this face, that's pavement, and select this face, which is green. There you go. That's a little bit easier on the eyes. Another thing that we can do is go in here in the top, viewport shading, lighting. These are some default lighting. I like to use the brightest one, which is this version over here, just so we can see things a little bit better in the user interface. Great. So now that we realized that we don't need that same kind of facade in here, in fact, we might not even need that, but I'll just leave this as a placeholder in there. Let's snap the cursor to over here. And now, well, we're going to do the same thing that we were doing before. Let's say go into edit mode for this edge. Alt Z is another hotkey that I'm catching myself that I'm using a lot, which is X-ray, right? So I want to grab this edge, Shift D, click, and the speed is going to increase here a little bit to more of the typical speed that I use. And now we're going to separate this. So right click, separate selection. So that becomes its own element. Make sure we're in selection box. There you go. Go into edit, select this thing. Now it's snapping, and let's just drag it to this edge over here. Doesn't even need to have a solid element. Now all of this is something that we're going to replicate with, oh, why did this do it twice? Oh, because we duplicated the object. So when we duplicate the object, we're also duplicating all the modifiers. So we actually have that phase happening on both sides because the mirror is still enabled. So let's disable the mirror or remove the mirror, and now that goes away. Excellent. So we have two more things to do. Fill the facade on this side for our massing to work well. And we need some kind of horizontal element to cover this gap that we have over here. Okay, and that's going to be secondary to sort of like the big, let's say, design mode that we have with this beveled, rounded, solid element. Okay, so how do we duplicate this? We can do the exact same thing here, which is Alt D to duplicate and hold these onto the other side. And they're not exactly on the edge, right? I think, how far are we coming out? I think it's like 1 meter. Make sure. Okay, we don't have this enabled. Where is my, there it is, our gizmo. And move this -1. Is that right? Yeah, -1 meter. Or, getting really excited here, we can use geometry nodes. So how do we do that? First off, let's add a mesh cube. And this is just our placeholder cube. We're going to add a modifier, geometry nodes. Let's click on new. It's a data tree. Geometry nodes can be also shared in a similar way to materials and to mesh data, like so. Now, this bottom screen over here, we're going to make this from a timeline. It can be anything else, by the way. It can also be a 3D viewport, right? It can be properties. Where are the properties? A timeline, or in this case, we want the geometry node editor. And now we're entering the world of geometry nodes. But in this case, it's going to be a very simple world. It's not going to be a terribly complex world. So we have our facade base over here, which we conveniently already made into its own collection. Except this cube. Let's get rid of this cube. We're going to drag it into our general collection. And we're going to drag this facade base collection into geometry nodes. And now all that information comes inside of here. And now you see it has the right thing selected. And now let's just click on this. And first off, it makes the location original. We want to use relative location. Now, where in the world is that? So let's click on our cube and let's reset the location by going to Object, Clear, Location. And now the location is over there. And now you can see that it's in the exact same position. In fact, the actual position doesn't matter much because we have chosen relative. If we choose original and we move, you can see that now it sort of moves itself around. But we can use relative and the actual location doesn't even matter at all. We can put our placeholder cube to location, which is what we're moving here, but we're not seeing it because we have the modifier enabled. So if I disable the modifier by clicking here, we can see the cube, but we're not seeing it, right? So let's turn off the facade base and you see we still have something there. Now, what we want to do is mirror that and transform it. So, and we know the distance. So transform geometry. We can press the space bar in the same way. We can press the space bar in the 3D viewport to search for any kind of node command, or again, layout is similar. We go here into add and we have everything. So, or also we can press Shift A and we can also search in here. So that's the whole nodes menu. There's quite a lot of things to cover, but we're going to start with the really basics. So one that we're going to use a lot is transform geometry. With Blender, with nodes, it's really cool, really convenient because we can just drag a new node on top of an existing node connection. And you can see how that green gets highlighted and drag it and it automatically creates things. Now we want to change the scale to along, which one is it now? Is it the X or the Y? I think it's the Y, to -1. Now we're dealing with just a simple plane, so it doesn't really do that much for us. And now let's use the original location. Where did it go? And the original location is somewhere over here. So let's see, how do we want to align that? Let's just keep it simple and use relative. We're going to snap, and you see we're snapping to that edge, but it's going on the other side. There's a weird thing happening with the spacing, and that has to do with the collection's sort of offset from the origin point. But that's okay. All we need to do is snap to the midpoint and a little more. Let's now move 2 more meters inside. No, 1 more meter inside. There you go. The simplest possible geometry nodes setup that we can have. We're taking a collection, we're scaling it by -1 to kind of flip it, we rotate it. The only other thing we need to do now is flip our faces. So let's turn on the original, go in here in the viewport and make sure we check face orientation. If we look at that face orientation, oh, it's also rotated. Yeah, that's good. We don't need to do anything more. Basically, red means the face is facing against you and red is positive. So we want to see blues for our face orientation and the inside is red. Great. Okay. So let's turn off this wireframe. No, face orientation. And last element to add is this edge over here. Once again, we're going to use an element from here just because it's easier to duplicate. So I'm going into edit mode in here, Shift D, escape to keep it there, extrude now this region up to there and extrude it in that direction. And this is all, should we leave that as one? No, we won't do that. Let's just make it the way I want to make it, which is for it to come to somewhere over here. There you go. Now, to select everything linked, there's a really nice hotkey again, right? Which is L. So hovering over an object and pressing L selects everything that's kind of linked, that shares vertex data, right? So we don't share any vertex data here. We can do the same here, L and L. Now we selected everything, so Alt-A deselect everything and select everything here. Why? Because we want to separate this object again. Right click and separate, selection. Okay, now we need to go into object mode, select that new element here, then go and remove the array because we don't need the array. Excellent. So now we've got our element, and yeah, we need to put this in the back as well. Oh, we can actually use mirror. In this case, mirror, because the origin point is kept and changed from X to Y. And we've got our initial setup done. Excellent. Now let's go and start playing a little bit with previews. So you have like a really nice finish line at the end of each chapter, even though this chapter is a fairly long one. It's basically half the course, a little bit less, but yeah. Okay, so now let's click on this material preview. And we get not that much, right? We get a little bit of shadow because we have got, what do we have in here? We don't even have a light. Where's that shadow coming from? I guess it's coming from the background. Okay, but why do we want to do that? Let's start assigning just some very subtle variations of materials. First off, I want to move our person. Where is he? Somewhere over here. Now I have snap still enabled, so let's disable that. And he's all triangulated once again because we have wireframe. We can change the opacity just to turn that down. Okay. And let's start assigning some of the materials. We already have the materials set up, right? Which is a big step. This is actually half the step of doing these kinds of things. And now let's go into glass. That's the first thing we're going to adjust. Expand on surface. And we want to change the base color. Well, actually, we can keep it. We want to change the roughness to 0. So now that's going to make this a reflective material, which we don't really see much of. Well, we can see it here a bit. We can make it a little darker, so change the base color. And we can change the alpha as well, so it becomes slightly transparent. Now, by default, because we are in Eevee, the alphas are dithered. I think we can change that here in the settings. Render method. So we can have a dithered or a blended render method. Blended looks cleaner, but it's less accurate for opacities, but it makes things a little bit easier. And this is per material setting, right? So we made this glass transparent, so now it works a little bit better. The next thing is the ground element solid. It's not ground, let's call it ground facade. Ground facade, solid. And in the surface, we're just going to change the base color to something darker. Yeah. And for these facade bases, we don't even have a material yet. So let's create a new and call it facade panel. Now we're going to be sort of tessellating things, not with tissue, by the way. You might have seen some of my other videos with tissue and tessellations. We can do fantastic parametric things. And it's actually easy in this case because everything is exactly the same, but this is, let's say, more rudimentary tessellation, right? Because we're going to be using the exact same size panel in the next video to generate the facade elements. So now with this facade panel here, again, it's just a placeholder, but we can go and maybe make it slightly darker or some other color just to understand that this is different. And we can turn the roughness down. And there it is. That's our very initial setup. We can even hide these initial ones by pressing H, and you can see H sort of hides all of them in here. And what else can we do? So in render, we didn't talk too much about it, but we can also use cycles or Eevee. Eevee is the default one, which is in material preview. That's what we're using. And I want to scroll all the way down to color management, AGX, and let's transform the look to high contrast. And now the lights are a little bit lighter and the darks are a little bit darker. Okay, so to finish this off, we can add a camera. Do we have a camera? We have a camera. Well, I'll erase it. Let's erase this camera and let's add a new camera. So add camera. And by default, it puts it where our cursor is. I forgot what that's called for there for a second. And let's put this somewhere at 1.75 meters. It's eye level, right? So if you're 1.18, 1.75, probably the average is a little bit lower. Also depending on where you're in the world. Doesn't matter that much though, because we can still adjust the camera settings. Now to see what the camera is seeing, first off, we have to make sure that the camera is active, which we can tell by this filled triangle, not a rectangle, triangle over here. If I duplicate this camera, Shift D, you see this one is not filled. So this is the active camera, that's not the active camera. To make this one now the active camera, we need to find it in the outliner, which is over here. And we'll click on the green icon and that makes it active. Yeah. And to preview the camera, we click on this camera view over here. Now, super cool. This is where Blender's user interface magic comes into play. We can right click here and do a vertical split. So we can split this viewport. So what are we going to do? First off, let's hide the toolbar on this side and the sidebar. And this is just going to be our camera preview. Let's make this toolbar a little bit smaller as well. And here we're going to be positioning our camera. This doesn't even need to be in the same kind of location. And now let's move the camera back a little. Maybe it's somewhere on the road, that's fine. Let's expand the properties. Make sure we go to object data properties. Notice now we have a camera icon. If we click on a mesh, we have a mesh icon, and you know, the order of things that we can do to meshes is a lot more than cameras. So, but everything associated with cameras is available to us here with this camera. Focal length, let's change this to 24 millimeters. And right away, this is much nicer. And now we want to shift the Y, let's see, 0.3 meters. That's too much. Let's try 0.2. That's about right. So the idea is for us to be able to see everything on the camera. Now, the default camera size is also a little bit small. You know, if you have too many, they can get lost. So we can increase that in the viewport display size and change that to 5 meters. So that's just something that makes it a little bit better. Now, we definitely need to see that little top there that's clipping. So we can go to 0.24. Too much. But by the way, 1 is the max, right? So that's, if we see here, it shows us what's happening. It's pretty cool. We can actually create multiple cameras to capture like something really vertical, or really horizontal or something like that. Let's duplicate this camera, escape, and change this to 0. And you can see, oh, it's not actually, it's 2 up. It's not 1 up. Anyways, I thought it's that one should align exactly with there, but I'm a bit wrong. Maybe it's 0.5. Is it 0.5? Yeah, it's a bit weird. I thought there was some kind of parametric alignment to these two, but clearly not. So let's get rid of this camera and go back to 0.23. There you go. Now we're capturing the whole thing. So that's a pretty nice view we have, because this is in material preview. In here, we've got a couple of preset scene worlds, and these are ones that come with Blender, right? So we have like an indoor one, we have like an outdoor one, but the default one is really nice because we have some reflections. So that gives us a good sense. Now, if we were to render that, it's going to look different, because when we render, this is the render preview, that's what it's going to look like. And I guess I already have a setup here for the background for the world, which is sort of a world, a shader node. But right now we won't even worry about that, because all we can do is grab this and go in view and viewport render image, which is different than a proper render. This captures what we've got in the viewport and makes that and saves that nicely, you know, so it's the proper size and everything. And by default, the default size is 1920 by 1080 at 100%. So let's go now, view, viewport, render image. And that's going to render exactly like we have in that viewport, including, you know, seeing some things that we don't want to see, like that camera. So let's hide that camera, H, and do that again. The nice thing also is that we capture these outlines, the wireframe. We can reduce the amount of wireframe. Does it do anything? Not that much really. But the opacity can be changed. Yeah, so without seeing the whole opacity, we can see something like that. View, viewport, render image. And there you go. So we have a very nice sort of base to work with that we're going to expand with in the next lesson. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. Again, these files are going to be on Patreon and uhstudioacademy.com. Not so much to charge money for this, because I don't even think you need to buy these files, but it's more to show your support for the work that I'm doing. So see you in the next chapter.